My brother inherited everything, but there was one thing he didn't know. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon for upcoming more interesting videos.
My name is Natalie Carter. I am 31 years old, and I live in Seattle, Washington. And the story I am about to share began on a quiet gray morning that felt heavier than most days because our family had gathered to say goodbye to my grandfather. He had been the strongest presence in our lives for as long as I could remember, a man who built his success through patience, discipline, and careful choices. And although he rarely spoke about his wealth, everyone in the family understood that he owned a large estate outside the city, along with several valuable properties. His passing left behind not only grief, but also a question that quietly lingered in everyone's mind. What would happen to everything he had spent his lifetime building? A week after the funeral, our family met at a small law office to hear the reading of his will. The atmosphere inside the room felt tense, even though no one openly admitted it. My parents sat quietly beside my older brother, Ethan, who looked unusually confident, as if he already knew how the story would end. Ethan had always been the kind of person who believed life would naturally reward him. He carried himself with an easy certainty that often impressed people. Even when he had done very little to earn it growing up, he was used to being admired by relatives and family friends, while I had always been more reserved, focusing on schoolwork and small responsibilities that rarely attracted attention. When the lawyer finally began reading the document, the room fell completely silent. The first several minutes were filled with formal details about smaller assets, donations, and personal belongings. But eventually, the moment arrived when the future of the estate was announced. The lawyer calmly explained that my grandfather had chosen to leave the majority of his property, including the large family house and most of his financial assets, to Ethan. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than expected, as if everyone needed a few seconds to process them. My parents exchanged relieved glances, and Ethan sat slightly straighter in his chair, clearly satisfied with the outcome. I felt a strange mixture of disappointment and confusion because, although I had never expected a fortune, I also believed my grandfather valued fairness and careful judgment. More than anything else, the idea that everything had been placed in the hands of my brother felt surprising. Yet the lawyer was not finished. He continued reading and mentioned that I had also been left something small, a sealed envelope that had been prepared personally by my grandfather. Before his death, the envelope was handed to me across the table, and compared to the large inheritance Ethan had just received, it seemed almost insignificant. I held it quietly without opening it, unsure what to think about the situation around me. Ethan quickly began discussing the future of the estate with my parents, talking about renovations plans for the property and the possibility of turning parts of the land into profitable ventures. His excitement filled the room while I remained silent, observing the moment with a calm expression that hid the quiet storm of thoughts moving through my mind. Eventually, the meeting ended, and everyone began leaving the office. My parents congratulated Ethan and spoke about how proud my grandfather would have been to see the estate continue through him. I simply nodded and stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, still holding the small envelope in my hand. The sky above Seattle looked heavy with clouds, and the streets were wet from earlier rain, creating the kind of reflective, quiet atmosphere that often appears after emotional days. I walked slowly toward my car, wondering if the envelope contained nothing more than a sentimental note, or perhaps a small keepsake meant to comfort me after the disappointment of the will. Reading part of me felt tempted to open it immediately, but another part wanted to wait until I was alone somewhere quiet, where I could read whatever message my grandfather had left without the noise of other people's expectations surrounding me. Later that evening, after returning to my apartment, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, placed the envelope in front of me, and carefully turned it over in my hands. The paper felt old and slightly textured, as if it had been prepared long before the events of the past week. The silence inside my apartment made the moment feel more important than I expected, and as I slowly opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside, I realized that whatever my grandfather had chosen to leave me was not meant to compete with the fortune Ethan had inherited, but rather to reveal something far more important, something that would soon change the way I understood the entire story of the inheritance. After opening the envelope that evening, I discovered that what my grandfather left me was not money or property, but something far more mysterious inside the folded letter was a small old key taped carefully to the paper, along with a short handwritten message. The writing was instantly recognizable because I had seen his steady handwriting many times in birthday cards and small notes he used to leave around the house. The message itself was simple yet strangely meaningful. It explained that some things in life could only be understood by the person willing to look deeper than the surface, and that he trusted me to see what others might overlook. He wrote that the key would guide me to something important inside the family estate, and that when the time felt right, I would know exactly where it belonged. The words were calm and thoughtful, just like the way he used to speak during quiet conversations when I visited him as a child. After reading the letter several times, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the small brass key resting in my palm, wondering what it might open. The idea that my grandfather had prepared something hidden inside the estate felt both exciting and confusing, because the property had always seemed completely familiar to me. I had spent many weekends there growing up, walking through the large gardens, exploring the wide hallways, and listening to stories about the history of the house. Yet despite those memories, I could not recall any locked places that required a key like this. Meanwhile, life around the estate moved forward quickly. After the will reading, Ethan wasted no time moving into the property with a level of excitement that made it clear he believed the entire place now belonged fully to him. Relatives began visiting the house again to congratulate him and discuss future plans, while my parents seemed relieved that the estate had stayed within the immediate family. According to the occasional updates I heard, Ethan had already started thinking about modernizing the house by making renovations, upgrading certain rooms, and possibly turning part of the land into a profitable investment project. Listening to those stories from a distance made the situation feel slightly surreal, because the house had always represented something traditional and quiet in my memories, a place where my grandfather preferred stability and patience over quick decisions. Yet now the property was becoming the center of ambitious plans that felt very different from the careful way he used to manage things. The small key and the mysterious letter stayed with me during those days, resting in my bag as I continued my normal routine at work. But the curiosity they created slowly grew stronger each time I thought about the message. I remembered how my grandfather used to value observation and attention to detail. He often believed that the most important answers were hidden in places people rarely noticed. Eventually, the feeling became too strong to ignore, and I decided to visit the estate one more time, not to challenge the inheritance or question Ethan ownership, but simply to walk through the house and see if anything triggered a memory connected to the key. When I arrived at the property, the afternoon sun was shining through the tall trees surrounding the estate, creating long shadows across the garden paths. The place looked almost exactly the same as it had during my childhood, except for a few signs that Ethan had already started making changes. New equipment was sitting near the driveway, and several boxes had been moved into the entrance hall, as if the house was preparing for a transformation. Inside, the familiar scent of old wood and polished floors filled the air as I walked slowly through the rooms. Remembering quiet afternoons spent there with my grandfather reading books or listening to his stories about the history of the family, I wandered through the living room, the study, and even the long hallway that led to the back of the house, but nothing seemed to match the size or shape of the small key I carried. Eventually, my steps took me toward the lower level, where the basement entrance had always been located. The basement itself was not a place I had explored often as a child, because it was mostly used for storage, but something about the quiet darkness of that part of the house made me pause for a moment as I walked down the narrow, steps the air felt cooler, and the faint sound of distant footsteps from the upper floor reminded me that Ethan was somewhere in the house making plans. For his new future, when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I began looking around, slowly scanning the walls and corners with new attention, and that was when I noticed something unusual near the far side of the basement, a narrow door partially hidden behind an old shelf, a door I did not remember seeing opened even once during all the years I had visited the estate, and as I stepped closer, noticing the small metal lock placed quietly in the center of the door, I suddenly realized that the key resting in my hand might finally have found the place it was meant to open, standing in the quiet basement of the estate. I looked closely at the narrow door that had been hidden behind the old shelf for as long as I could remember, yet somehow I had never truly noticed it before. The surface of the door was plain and slightly worn, as if it had been there for many years. Without attracting attention, the small metal lock in the center immediately caught my eye because it matched the size of the key my grandfather had left inside the envelope. For a moment, I simply stood there, listening to the faint sounds of movement from the upper floor of the house, where Ethan was likely continuing his plans for renovations and changes to the property. The contrast between his excitement upstairs and the quiet mystery in front of me made the moment feel strangely important. I slowly stepped forward and gently moved the shelf aside, creating enough space to reach the lock. My hand felt steady as I took the small brass key from my pocket and placed it into the metal opening. The key slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting there for a long time. When I turned it, the lock clicked open with a soft sound that echoed slightly through the basement. The door itself opened slowly, revealing a small storage room that had clearly been organized with careful intention. Inside the room, several wooden shelves lined the walls, each one filled with boxes, folders, and neatly stacked documents. A single small desk stood near the center of the space, with a lamp resting on top, creating the impression that someone had once spent time working quietly in this hidden area. The air carried the faint scent of old paper and polished wood, reminding me of the study where my grandfather used to keep his records. When I stepped inside the room, I immediately noticed that everything had been arranged in a very deliberate way. Each box was labeled, and many of the folders contained dates that stretched back years, even decades. It was obvious that my grandfather had used this space as a private archive for things he considered important. I began examining the shelves, carefully opening several folders that contained property documents, financial records, and handwritten notes explaining various decisions he had made over the years. The more I looked through the materials, the clearer it became that the room held information about nearly every major investment and agreement connected to the estate. There were journals as well, filled with his neat handwriting, describing his thoughts about the future of the property and the responsibilities that came with owning something so valuable. Reading those pages felt like hearing his voice again, calm, thoughtful, and always focused on the long-term consequences of every choice. As I continued exploring, I discovered a section of files placed together inside a large wooden box near the back wall. These documents looked newer than the others, and many of them contained legal language connected to ownership rights and financial protections attached to the estate. I sat down at the desk and began studying the pages, slowly realizing that the inheritance Ethan had received might not be as simple as it first appeared. Several of the papers described a legal trust created by my grandfather years earlier, designed to protect the property from being misused or sold without careful consideration. According to the records, the estate was tied to a structure that required certain responsibilities to be respected by whoever controlled the house. Those responsibilities included maintaining the property, properly protecting the surrounding land, and avoiding decisions that placed the estate at unnecessary financial risk. What surprised me most was the final section of the documents, which described what would happen if those responsibilities were ignored. In that case, the trust allowed control of the estate to be transferred to another individual chosen by my grandfather, someone he believed would protect the property according to the values he had spent his life building. As I read those words, a strange realization began forming in my mind because the letter inside the envelope suddenly made much more sense. The key had not been meant to give me money or power directly. It had been meant to reveal the truth about the inheritance before anyone else discovered it. I looked again at the final page of the document, noticing the signature at the bottom, along with a carefully written name identifying the person my grandfather trusted to understand the responsibilities connected to the estate. And in that quiet hidden room beneath the house Ethan believed he owned, I realized that the future of the entire property might depend on information he did not even know existed yet. After leaving the hidden room in the basement, with the documents carefully placed back into the wooden box, my mind felt filled with questions that had not existed before the discovery. The inheritance that once seemed simple now appeared to be part of a carefully designed plan created by my grandfather long before his passing. During the following days, I spent time reading through the files again, making sure I understood every detail about the legal trust connected to the estate. The documents explained that the house, the surrounding land, and several financial assets were tied together under a structure meant to protect the property from reckless decisions my grandfather believed. The estate represented more than just money. It represented family history, responsibility, and long-term stability. Because of that belief, he created conditions that the person managing the estate would need to respect. Those conditions required careful maintenance of the property, responsible financial planning, and protection of the land from being sold or used for risky investments. The more I studied the papers, the clearer it became that my grandfather expected the person controlling the estate to think patiently about the future, rather than chasing quick profit or dramatic changes. Meanwhile, life at the house continued moving forward under Ethan's leadership. He had already begun imagining ways to transform the estate into something modern and profitable. Contractors started visiting the property, bringing measurements, ideas, and renovation plans that involved large changes to several rooms and sections of the land. Trucks carrying building supplies appeared near the driveway, and temporary equipment was placed around the gardens, as if the quiet, peaceful estate was preparing for a completely new identity. Every time I visited, I noticed Ethan speaking enthusiastically about potential business opportunities connected to the land. He described possibilities like building luxury guest houses, hosting private events, or even selling portions of the surrounding fields to developers who were interested in constructing expensive homes nearby. From his perspective, these ideas represented progress and success. But as I listened to those plans, I could not ignore the information stored inside the hidden basement room. Many of the decisions he was considering directly conflicted with the responsibilities described in the trust documents. The estate had been legally protected from exactly those kinds of actions because my grandfather feared that someone might eventually treat the property as a short-term investment instead of a long-term legacy. As weeks passed, the gap between the trust conditions and Ethan's decisions grew wider. New renovation projects began without careful evaluation of how they affected the original structure of the house, and discussions about selling sections of land became more serious as investors expressed interest in the valuable property surrounding the estate. Watching those developments created a strange feeling because I knew something important that no one else in the family seemed aware of. The trust documents included a clause explaining what would happen if the responsibilities connected to the estate were ignored. If the person managing the property violated those conditions, the trust allowed control of the estate to be transferred to another individual chosen by my grandfather, someone he believed would protect the property according to his values. The final page of the documents made that intention very clear. The name written there identified the person who would receive authority if the estate was placed at risk. Reading that page several times left no doubt about what my grandfather had planned. The sealed envelope, the small key, and the hidden room had all been part of a quiet safeguard meant to reveal the truth only. When it became necessary, realizing this placed me in an unexpected position, because I now understood that Ethan ownership of the estate was not absolute. It depended on whether he respected the responsibilities attached to the property. Each new decision he made moved the situation closer to the moment when the trust conditions might be officially questioned. And if that moment arrived, the legal structure my grandfather created would determine the real future of the estate in a way that Ethan had never imagined when he proudly walked out of the lawyer's office, believing he had inherited everything. In the weeks that followed the discovery of the trust, documents the situation at the estate continued changing in ways that slowly moved closer to the moment my grandfather had clearly prepared for. Ethan remained confident that the property belonged entirely to him, and his plans for the land became more ambitious with each passing day. Contractors continued visiting the estate, bringing new equipment and discussing larger renovation projects that would dramatically change the structure of the house. Sections of the surrounding land were also being evaluated by developers who believed the area could become a profitable location for luxury homes. From Ethan's point of view, these decisions represented progress and success, because he believed transforming the estate into a modern investment would increase its value. However, each step he took moved further away from the responsibilities described in the trust my grandfather had created. Those documents clearly explained that the estate was meant to remain protected from exactly these kinds of decisions. The house and land were intended to be preserved carefully, not divided into smaller pieces or used for risky financial ventures. I watched these changes quietly for a while, hoping that Ethan might eventually reconsider some of the more extreme plans. But as the weeks passed, it became obvious that he saw no reason to slow down. The property had become a symbol of opportunity in his mind, and every new proposal from investors or contractors only encouraged him to move faster. Eventually, the situation reached a point where the conditions of the trust could no longer be ignored. The renovations being planned would permanently alter parts of the estate that my grandfather had specifically protected, and discussions about selling portions of the land were becoming serious enough to involve legal paperwork. Realizing that moment had arrived, I returned to the hidden room in the basement and carefully gathered the documents my grandfather had left behind, including the final pages that explained what would happen if the responsibilities connected to the estate were violated. Those papers were then shared with the family lawyer who had originally handled the reading of the will. Once the lawyer reviewed the trust structure and the recent decisions being made at the estate, the reality of the situation became clear. The inheritance Ethan believed was absolute had always been conditional. According to the trust, the estate could only remain under his control if the property was managed according to the guidelines my grandfather had established. By moving forward with plans that placed the land at risk, those conditions had been broken. The legal clause my grandfather prepared years earlier was now activated, transferring authority over the estate to the person he believed would protect it responsibly. When the final decision was formally explained to the family, the atmosphere felt very different from the confident moment that followed the original will. Reading the truth was now impossible. To ignore the estate Ethan thought he owned had legally passed into my hands, not because of revenge or competition, but because my grandfather had trusted my judgment and patience more than the excitement of quick success. Receiving that responsibility felt heavy rather than victorious. Because the property represented decades of family history and careful work, rather than celebrating the change, I focused on honoring the reason my grandfather created the trust in the first place. The renovations that threatened the character of the house were stopped. The plans to divide the land were canceled, and the estate slowly returned to the quiet stability it once had. Ethan faced the difficult reality of his decisions, while our parents began understanding why my grandfather had designed the inheritance in such a careful way. The one thing Ethan never knew when he first walked into the lawyer's office believing he had inherited everything was that the true ownership of the estate had never been about wealth alone. It had always depended on responsibility, patience, and the quiet ability to protect something valuable for the future, rather than risking it for quick success.